Okay, wow, you sent me some really fascinating research this time about how people talk about food. I have to admit, I had no idea how deep this topic could actually go.
It's true. Food talk, it can seem really superficial on the surface, right? But if you dig a little deeper, it reveals a whole lot about our cultural values, personal identities, and even, believe it or not, our political leanings.
Seriously, I mean, I'm looking at the title of this study here, Tove Odu, which is Conversations About Food, Culture, Identity, Politics in Korean.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is how food, something so essential to our everyday lives, can provide such a rich and sometimes even unexpected source of insight into who we are and what we believe.
Absolutely. And this study actually starts off with this really interesting anecdote about a kindergarten classroom in Denmark. So imagine this, right? A teacher is questioning an immigrant student about bringing flatbread for lunch, basically implying that it's not a good lunch compared to traditional Danish rye bread.
Hmm. And that seemingly innocent comment, right? It really highlights how our food choices, and even more so, the language that we use to discuss them, can actually become markers of cultural identity. And sometimes, unfortunately, those markers can lead to unintentional bias or even judgment.
It's like what we choose to eat, or even what we choose not to eat, can become a symbol of belonging or not belonging to a particular group.
Precisely. And linguistic anthropologists, they're the folks who study the relationship between language and culture. They suggest that food talk can even reflect broader societal issues, like immigration, globalization, and even nationalism.
That's a great point, and it reminds me of how certain foods have been or are sometimes promoted as like national symbols.
Yeah.
Like I remember seeing government campaigns in different countries that really encourage people to buy and eat locally produced food as a way to support the national economy and, well, their national identity too.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how food can be used to promote a particular national identity. And when those national identities are challenged, as they often are in times of globalization and increased immigration, food can actually become a battleground for expressing those anxieties.
It's incredible to think about how something as simple as, opening a lunchbox could actually spark such complex conversations about culture and identity.
Oh, absolutely. And this complexity is really evident when we start looking at how food conversations actually vary across different cultures around the world.
So let's take a quick trip around the globe then, shall we?
Let's. For example, this research contrasts American families' focus on healthy food with Italian families' emphasis on tasty food.
That's interesting, especially considering that, a lot of these health trends actually originated in Europe. I wonder, do you think those lines are blurring at all these days? Like, are Italian families starting to become more health conscious in their food choices?
That's a good question. And while traditional values, around taste and enjoyment, they remain really strong in Italian culture, there's definitely no doubt that global health trends are starting to influence food choices there as well.
So it's not a simple, either or kind of thing anymore. It's more like this really complex interplay of traditional values and modern global influences.
Exactly. And, even the norms around family meal times, those differ significantly across cultures, too. For example, French children, well, they're often encouraged to actually critique food, developing their palates and culinary vocabulary from a young age.
That's so different from, like the emphasis on politeness and avoiding criticism that you see in other cultures.
It is. And then you have cultures like Sweden, where shared meals are viewed as a symbol of egalitarianism, where everyone takes equal portions and everyone contributes to the conversation.
And in contrast to that, the study mentions that in Java, mealtime is, well, often a completely silent affair.
That's right. Silence during meals is viewed as a sign of respect, of really focusing on the act of eating itself.
These contrasting examples just highlight how food talk, or even sometimes the lack of it, can reflect these much deeper cultural values and norms.
Precisely. Now, to illustrate how food can become so intertwined with national identity and politics, let's take a closer look at the case study of pork in Denmark.
Yeah, the study mentions how pork went from being, just a traditional food to becoming an actual symbol of Danishness. And I found that really interesting.
It is a really fascinating example. That controversy surrounding the removal of pork from preschool menus in Denmark, it wasn't just about, dietary preferences. It really tapped into a much larger debate about immigration and national identity.
It's like the humble pork chop.
Yeah, right.
It somehow became this flashpoint for anxieties about about cultural change.
Exactly. Some Danes, they saw the removal of pork as a concession to immigrant cultures
Mm.
and as a threat to their own traditions. And, it sparked these really heated debates about what it actually means to be Danish in a world that's rapidly changing around them.
The study also mentioned a shift in the language that's used to describe pork in Denmark, right? From svin to gris.
That's right. Svin has taken on more negative connotations over time, while gris is seen as more neutral and palatable. And this might reflect, a bit of a softening of attitudes toward pork in light of these cultural shifts.
It really seems like food, it can act as like a cultural barometer in a way. It's like it reflects the changing values and anxieties of a whole society.
That's a really good way to put it. And that actually leads us into another really fascinating aspect of food talk, which is its connection to personal identity in today's, increasingly globalized world. What we're seeing is a shift, a real shift, from defining ourselves primarily by our jobs to defining ourselves by what we consume.
So instead of saying I'm a teacher or, I'm a doctor, now people are more likely to say I'm vegan or like I'm a foodie.
Exactly. You got it. Food choices have become this way for individuals to align themselves with specific groups, to express their values. It's almost like they're curating a personal brand through, their dietary preferences.
But wouldn't you say there's a potential downside to that? I mean, with so many options and labels out there, it seems like there could be a lot of pressure to make the right choices and then even lead to judgment or exclusion of others who don't, share those same values.
That's a really valid concern. While this shift towards food-based identities can be empowering, right? Because it allows individuals to express themselves and connect with like-minded communities, it can also definitely contribute to anxieties about making those perfect choices and even, unfortunately fuel eating disorders.
It's kind of like, it's like this double-edged sword where food can be both a source of connection, but also a source of anxiety, depending how you look at it.
Precisely. And the internet and social media, while they offer this amazing platform for sharing and connecting around food, they also definitely amplify these trends. And they can create these echo chambers where certain dietary ideologies, become really dominant and even sometimes extreme.
It's interesting to think how, the very tools that are supposed to help us connect can also create these divisions and anxieties around something like food.
It's true. It's like a paradox of our modern age. It really is. And this leads us into another significant trend in food talk, the increasing moralization of food production and consumption.
Yeah. The study talks about how language is actually being used to create value judgments around food. The whole concept of authenticity, for example. It seems like it's taken on like a whole new meaning in the food world.
Oh, absolutely. Authenticity is often used to differentiate food that's perceived as more natural, more traditional, maybe more ethical, and it suggests that it's morally superior to food that's produced through, industrial methods.
But isn't focusing on authenticity like just another form of elitism? I mean, not everyone can afford to buy organic, locally sourced food, or even has the time to cook these elaborate meals from scratch.
That's a great point, a really excellent point. While the desire for connection and sustainability is completely understandable, there is a risk that the pursuit of authenticity can become very exclusionary and even perpetuate, existing class divides.
So it's not as simple as just saying, authentic food is good and industrial food is bad. There's a whole spectrum of values and considerations that we have to think about here.
Exactly. And this ties into the rise of farmers markets and small-scale production, as this reaction to the perceived negative consequences of industrialization. People are actively looking for ways to reconnect with their food, to understand where it comes from, how it's produced, all of that.
It's almost like this yearning for a simpler, maybe a more wholesome way of eating, even if it's not always accessible or, practical for everyone.
Precisely. And this brings us to the future of food talk. What are the trends that are emerging? And, what challenges are we facing going forward?
This study presents some kind of contrasting viewpoints on this, right? There's both pessimism and optimism about where these food conversations are headed.
That's right. On one hand, you have this concern about the commodification of movements like slow food, where those original values of sustainability and community are potentially being exploited for profit.
And can you actually explain what slow food is for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. So slow food, it's a global movement that promotes local food cultures and more traditional ways of cooking. And it really emphasizes, quality, sustainability, and that connection to the land. It's a reaction, a direct reaction against the fast-paced industrialized food system that we have now that often prioritizes convenience over, quality and connection.
So the concern is that this genuine desire that people have for connection and sustainability is being co-opted by marketing and consumerism.
Exactly. There's that risk that slow food could become just another trendy label, completely detached from its original values.
And on the other hand, you mentioned that there's also optimism about the future of food talk. So what's driving that optimism?
Well, the optimism stems from the growing awareness of the interconnectedness of food systems, environmental health, and social justice. There's this recognition that our food choices have consequences that extend way beyond just our individual plates.
So there's a sense of hope that we can use food talk as a tool for positive change then.
Precisely. By engaging in more thoughtful conversations about food, we can raise awareness about these important issues and hopefully inspire action towards creating a more just and sustainable food system.
But the study also points out a potential challenge here, right? This growing gap between those who can afford to engage in these conversations and those who can't.
That's a crucial point. While it's really encouraging to see this growing awareness of sustainability and ethical food choices, there's always that risk that these conversations become dominated by those with privilege, and that further marginalizes those who are already struggling to just access healthy and affordable food.
So how do we ensure that these conversations about food and sustainability are inclusive and accessible to everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status?
That is the million-dollar question, and honestly one that requires, systemic change. It requires us to really address issues of poverty, food deserts, and unequal access to resources.
It seems like we need to move beyond just individual choices here and focus on actually creating a food system that's equitable and sustainable for absolutely everyone.
Absolutely. It's about ensuring that everyone has the right to good food, not just the privilege to choose it.
Yeah, it's a really powerful reminder that food justice, well, it's a really complex issue. It goes way beyond just those individual choices. It's about, creating a system, a food system, where everyone has access to nutritious and culturally appropriate food too.
Exactly. And that's exactly where the power of conversation comes in. By talking about these issues, by raising awareness and challenging those assumptions that we often have about food, we can hopefully contribute to building a more just and equitable food system for everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into, all this fascinating language surrounding food, what's the key takeaway that we want to leave with our listener today?
Well, I think the most important thing is just to listen. To really listen closely to the conversations that are happening around you about food. Pay attention to the language that's being used, the assumptions that are being made, and even the values that are being expressed.
And maybe even question those assumptions and challenge those values when it seems necessary.
Oh, absolutely. Don't be afraid to engage in a respectful dialogue about food, even if it means stepping outside of your comfort zone a little bit. You might just be surprised at what you learn and the connections that you can make by doing that.
Because ultimately, food is something that connects us all in some way, right?
It really is. It's a fundamental human need. It's a source of pleasure. It's a source of nourishment. And it's such a powerful symbol of culture and identity, too.
And the way we talk about food, it really does seem to reflect our deepest values and beliefs about the world.
So the next time you find yourself in a conversation about food, whether it's, about the latest food trend or a big debate about sustainable agriculture, just remember you're not just talking about what's on your plate.
You're engaging in a conversation about culture, about identity, even about politics, and really about the future of our planet.
And that's a conversation that's definitely worth having, don't you think?
Absolutely. Food for thought indeed. Well, thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.